Sam Lisenco, you're the production designer for Judas and the Black Messiah, which tells the true story of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton and how he was assassinated by the FBI. Now, this being a period film about real events, was this a more research-intensive production for you relative to other more contemporary films you've worked on?
Certainly. I think, we had a pretty practical approach towards a methodology of how to tackle subject matter that happened to be real. And there was an incredible wealth of information accessible to us from various resources as to how it actually looked. But I think a big factor between myself and Shaka in the development of the look of the movie was how can we make this as truthful as possible, but keep in mind the kinds of action movies that make the medicine go down a little easy. And so what wound up happening more often than not was our discussions would turn to kind of those Sunday afternoon movies where you're folding laundry and you've seen it a million times, but you just leave it on in the background because it's so comforting anyway. And we thought that if we started to explore those kinds of sort of genre normative cues, even subconsciously, we would be able to come up with a language that was much more entertaining while being as historically accurate as possible. So it was kind of a consistent dichotomy, but it was a lot of like the hot rock and the 7-Ups and Eddie Coyle and early Michael Mann stuff. It was like how can we subject the audience to what we imagine a movie to be, all the while trying to be as accurate to the historical truth as possible.
And what was the process like, trying to capture Chicago, in the 1960s? It's sort of a very important character in the film is the nature of the city itself.
Certainly. Well, we actually didn't shoot in Chicago, partially because of that, because the areas in particular in which the film takes place in Chicago don't look like they did enough in the middle to late 60s for what we needed out of it. But what we found was there was this kind of romantically beautiful, realist nature to elements. We wound up shooting in Cleveland, and what we found was like Rust Belt cities, in particular Ohio, but in general, Rust Belt cities had this layer of municipal practicality that hadn't changed, that was perfect for what we were trying to achieve. So, it still had mercury vapor and sodium vapor lights, and it still had coin-operated parking meters. And so I think there was this baseline language of the urban environment that worked very well for the time period. And then it was like, okay, can we identify chunks of this city that feel more architecturally like Chicago for us, and how can we best take advantage of that? So we were scouting the backs of buildings to see if we could find the kind of like the cantilevered wooden decking that you see in Chicago residential architecture and stuff. So it was really about figuring out how we could get a wide enough tapestry of the city and then kind of shoehorn the stuff that worked best within the confines of the script to try to make it work.
Fred Hampton being a real historical figure, there's a lot of footage of him from the period. Did you find yourself referring to a lot of that in terms of recreating some spaces that he was in that he's well known for?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was actually really easy to get lost in his speeches because he's so magnetic and he speaks such truth to power that after a few weeks I wound up just muting his speeches and watching him as opposed to listening to the content of his stuff, because it was just too distracting to try to isolate the visual. Became a little bit more problematic when you start getting swept up in the emotion of everything. There are ample photos of his apartment from the aftermath of the night he was killed. And so we stem to stern tried our best to accurately recreate, using some of the case files and evidence photos, like every stick of furniture in that space. And I think insofar as the reality versus our movie. The apartment itself, that interior is pretty darn close to what it actually looked like. Um, in terms of some of the other ancillary things and like Black Panther headquarters and stuff, that became an amalgam of research elements that we liked from various Black Panther offices around the country. And there was stuff where we knew it felt right, but even though it wasn't necessarily 100% accurate to the Chicago branch office, but it reached a point where we had some of the elder statesmen in the Panther Party, specifically Mama Kua, who went by Deborah at the time. She came in and she looked at the sets and she was like, this feels right. And it's like, okay, if we've gotten to this place where you're not thinking about it critically, and it just feels right enough for people who were there at the time to be lost in the fiction in the day's work, then I think that we got to a place where it was pretty good.
Another scene that's especially memorable for just the physical space is the shootout between the Black Panthers and the police, where of course the police set fire to the headquarters, and we see the aftermath of that. What was it like working on that and recreating that event?
Well, Cleveland has a pretty interesting feature to it, which is that it has been so economically depressed for such a long period of time that you have these holes in the landscape where buildings were raised because it became cheaper to demolish than it was to try to renovate. And so we needed just a small region in which we could have a cluster of buildings thick enough to feel like you were in an urban environment. And we happened upon this triangular intersection that we could rationalize dressing 360 and work within that space. And then we happened to get very lucky with that one building, which was enough of an architectural match on the ground floor to what we needed to be able to work with it. It was funny because it kind of bleeds into what I was saying about making like a movie as opposed to a film. It became sort of a backlot for us, this intersection, and we were redirecting traffic, and the locals weren't thrilled about the fact that we'd taken over this major metropolitan thoroughfare. But for a good chunk of about a week and a half, that was our Paramount Pictures lot. That was, that was the traditional kind of movie lot that you perceive only from old Hollywood, and so we had coordinated off in such an efficient way that that it felt like we had an incredible level of control.
And there's such a contrast with the FBI spaces that we see. Especially that early scene with J. Edgar Hoover addressing the agents. It's this very spare, ominous kind of scene of him warning against the Black Messiah. What was it like? Creating that look and the feeling of that scene, because obviously we're feeling very different things watching that from what we're feeling with the Black Panther characters.
Well, we knew it had to be a pretty significant differentiation in vibe and feeling and scope, and the repetition of white faces in this crowd and what this space entailed, and the fact that they were kind of like a field of faceless field agents. So I think that the broadest scope of its repetitive nature was something that we knew was inherently going to be a juxtaposition visually to the rest of the movie. And there were, I don't want to say concerns, but it was always kind of a rational. I was always going to be like, this is a different look within the language of this film, and it's going to punctuate the film. And so I think we knew we needed to have some kind of creative control over how that felt. And so, God bless costume department for the amount of work that they had to do in that sequence. But I can't necessarily say it was something we labored over verbally for hours and hours about what the look of this thing was going to be, but we knew that it would be a punctuation, certainly, and that was definitely considered.
And what was the collaboration like with cinematographer Sean Bobbitt on really establishing a consistent look, a sense of color and lighting and all that?
Sure. I mean, Sean is just a straight gangster. He is so good at what he does, and incredibly giving and communicative. And those are kind of cheesy terms to throw around when you're talking about collaborators on a film, but he is incredibly efficient at allowing you, even when you're just watching on monitor, to get lost in the narrative without overthinking the process of cinematography. And it actually came very naturally. We were in these spaces that lent themselves in a lot of ways to particular color palettes, and a lot of the art department was giving me a hard time because so much of the film had so many muted greens in it. But we had pulled tons of vintage paint, lead-based paint samples, and these colors were always kind of consistent themes, these creams and these greens, and we ran tests with darker skin tones and what was working. And he got it right off the bat. Like, it didn't feel like there was a push-pull about creative impulse to get to a place where we were communicating about the language. It was always just like, this is right, and we know it's generally right, and if it's not right, we can kick the ball far enough downfield that we can at least get some forward momentum going in what this scene needs to look like. So there wasn't ever a period in which, like in terms of, especially with Sean, there wasn't any moment on that film in which there was discourse about what it needed to be. It was just like, yeah, exactly. Except, there was always kind of micro moments of figuring out how we can make it the best it could be, but never broad scope discussions about what it should be, if that makes sense.
And was there a large proportion of like real locations as opposed to built sets? Like, how many sets had to be built like from the ground up?
The key set from the ground up is the Hampton apartment. That was built stem to stern. The majority of the film otherwise was practical adaptations to real locations, based primarily on our mobility concerns and the nature of how a lot of the other locations, in particular Black Panther headquarters, the relationship between indoor and outdoor was integral. There are some smaller build elements throughout the film that, things like when the headquarters burns down, that's obviously, we didn't do that in the same site. We did that elsewhere. Cleveland doesn't have a wealth of stage space, so we were fighting an uphill battle in terms of where we could build things anyway. But we prioritized the apartment. That was something that we felt from day one that needed to be on stage for the level of control. And there are particular shots in the film that we transition over walls and through elements and stuff like that. So we wanted to make sure we could pull pieces of that apartment apart to get the camera where we needed it to go. I think that in terms of making other locations practically work, there is kind of an inherent language, especially in Sean's cinematography, of practicality that's born out of the fact that walls don't move, that I think is beneficial for this style of storytelling. So there wasn't necessarily, as I recall, there weren't moments where I was like, oh, I wish we could have built this. It was like, no, we should, it would be truer to the language of the story we're trying to tell if we can figure out how to do this on this rooftop, and so I think that was kind of a general MO that led us to going as far afield as possible for some of this stuff.
And in dressing like an existing physical space and adapting it for the film, what are some of the props and details that felt important to you in terms of making these spaces feel lived in and authentic to who the characters are and what the story is?
Yeah, I think people who've seen other things I've done always have this perception of my work as like hyper realistic and a lot of contemporary aesthetics. But in actuality, I think people wrongfully equate that with clutter, when really I think that there are beautiful moments of negative space in the film. And I think if you can figure out where not to play the drum solo, where to let it lie, and kind of dress in the edges, then those smaller elements feel much bigger than they actually are, and you can start to take advantage of what people perceive as lived-in realism. But in actuality, it's just like a little pocket of something that's only taking up a sliver of the frame. There's one beautiful shot in particular in FBI headquarters when Jesse Plemons' character is eating a sandwich at a table. And I fought really hard for absolutely nothing in that frame, and Sean was on board. It's those moments where it's like you're letting the film breathe a little bit, that I find that realism actually starts to bleed out a lot more efficiently than just your traditional layers on layers of dressing. That's not to say Becky Brown, the decorator, didn't bring it, because the girl brought it. I mean, we filled a warehouse, like a giant hangar, with industrial metal shelving. It was like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it was just every possible element of period dressing from a 25-year span that could potentially exist, with various options of everything. Because when you're especially when you're shopping in the Rust Belt, there's buildings full of stuff sitting around. So we would just buy whole estate sales and start cataloging everything, and like some kind of weirdo period department store. But I think there was always the effort to kind of overdress in a realistic way, and then just start peeling back the layers until it felt right. And there was a consideration made to try to capture period in a way that was more realistic than traditional studio period films that take place in this era, only because I think there's this misconception that people didn't have crap, and people had crap. People had crap for thousands of years. People have had crap, So there's a kitchen scene later on in the film where we had found at a sale in Ohio, in the back of the closet on the floor, were unopened rolls of paper towels, period rolls from the middle 60s. And it's like, yeah, of course you'd buy 3 or 4 rolls. You wouldn't just have the one roll sitting on. So being able to layer in elements like that felt real allowed us a lot of breathing room as to when we felt like we didn't need that kind of stuff.
Well, congratulations on the film and your work on it. And
Thank you.
I want to thank you so much for joining with me to talk about it today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's a cool movie. I hope everybody gets to see it.